My name is Amelia Jones. I'm 27 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years working as a pediatric occupational therapist, building a private practice that now serves 43 families across Millbrook County with a waitlist that stretches nearly 4 months out. That's the credibility. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right in my chest. 3 days before my wedding, my card declined at the altar rehearsal dinner deposit because my stepsister had quietly drained my entire $31,000 wedding fund. I want to tell you exactly what happened at that rehearsal dinner because I've replayed it every hour since. The venue coordinator pulled me aside, apologetic, and said, "I'm so sorry, Miss Jones, but your card was declined for the final balance." I stood there in the hallway of the Ashford Manor, my fiancé Daniel 3 feet away laughing with his groomsmen, having absolutely no idea that the account I'd spent 4 years building, dollar by dollar, from birthday checks and tax refunds and overtime shifts, currently held $214. But here's what I didn't know yet, standing in that hallway with my phone in my shaking hand. My stepsister, Brooke, had been added to that joint savings account 2 years earlier, back when we were getting closer, and I'd naively wanted a backup contact in case something happened to me. And 40 minutes later, sitting in my car in the venue parking lot, I would pull up the transaction history and see exactly where my $31,000 had gone. A leased BMW, a Cancun vacation with her boyfriend, and 3 separate designer handbag purchases. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all really started. If you're watching this tonight and something about it already feels a little too familiar, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I read every single comment. My parents divorced when I was 9, and my father remarried a woman named Denise 4 years later, bringing Brooke, 1 year younger than me, into our household in a small 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Avenue. From the very beginning, my stepmother made it clear, in the particular quiet way some women have, that Brooke's needs simply mattered more in our house. Brooke got the bigger bedroom because she got anxious in small spaces, a diagnosis I never once saw a doctor confirm. Brooke got a car at 16, a used Honda Civic paid for entirely by my father, while I took the bus through my entire junior and senior year, because Brooke needed the independence more, given her social anxiety. I never fully understood what that anxiety was supposed to look like, since Brooke seemed perfectly capable of attending every party in a 50-mile radius, staying out past curfew most weekends without consequence, while my own curfew was strictly enforced down to the minute. I remember specific moments from those years that still surface unexpectedly, the way old bruises ache before a storm. My 16th birthday, when my father forgot entirely, distracted by preparations for Brooke's dance recital the following weekend, and I spent the evening alone in my room with a store-bought cupcake I'd bought myself on the way home from the diner. Thanksgiving of my junior year, when Denise served Brooke's favorite dish first at every holiday, a small gesture that somehow always translated into the largest portion, the crispiest edges, the first pick of everything on the table, while I learned to simply wait my turn without comment. I became, over those years, remarkably skilled at not needing things, or at least not asking for them out loud, because asking rarely seemed to change the outcome and only ever seemed to draw attention to how much less I apparently deserved. I put myself through undergrad and graduate school almost entirely on loans and part-time work, waiting tables at a diner on Route 9 through most of my 20s, sometimes closing at midnight and opening again at 6 a.m. for a morning shift before class, while Brooke's education at a private art school was fully funded by my father and Denise, to the tune of $86,000 across 4 years, without a single loan attached, plus a monthly living stipend I never once received during my own schooling. I didn't resent it at the time or told myself I didn't, the way you tell yourself a lot of things to keep peace in a blended family that never quite felt like it belonged to me the way it belonged to Brooke. I finished my occupational therapy license in 2021, 6 years after starting my undergraduate degree, working the entire time, and built my practice from a single rented room above a dentist's office to a full clinic with 3 other therapists on staff, and by last year, I was earning enough to comfortably start saving toward the wedding I'd been dreaming about since I was a little girl, back when weddings were the one fantasy that felt entirely safely mine, untouched by whatever Brooke got, instead of me. I want to be fair here, because I've thought about this a lot since everything happened. Brooke and I weren't always distant. There were stretches, particularly in our early 20s, when we genuinely got along. Going to concerts together at the amphitheater downtown, commiserating about our parents' particular brand of dysfunction over cheap wine on her apartment balcony, even occasionally defending each other to outside friends who didn't understand our family's strange arithmetic of favoritism. I remember one specific night, the winter after I finished my undergraduate degree, when Brooke drove 2 hours in a snowstorm, just to sit with me in the waiting room after I'd broken my wrist ice skating, staying until 3 a.m. without a single complaint. It's part of why what happened later cut as deep as it did. This wasn't a stranger who took advantage of me. This was someone I genuinely, if imperfectly, loved and who I genuinely believed loved me back in her own complicated way. Looking back, I can trace certain warning signs I chose not to fully examine at the time. The way you avoid looking directly at a bright light, even when some part of you already suspects what it is. Brooke had struggled with money her entire adult life, despite the fully funded education and the steady support from our parents, cycling through jobs every year or two, always with a plausible explanation for why the last one just wasn't the right fit. She'd asked me for small loans twice before, both under $500, both eventually repaid, though slowly and with visible reluctance. I'd chalked it up to her simply being less financially disciplined than me, a difference in personality rather than a pattern worth genuinely worrying about. I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes after the fact, that those smaller loans were likely a kind of testing ground, a way of learning exactly how much latitude I'd extend before I started asking harder questions. I met Daniel Foster 3 years ago, a structural engineer with a steady, patient nature that felt like the opposite of the instability I grew up around, at a mutual friend's barbecue, where he spent 20 minutes helping me untangle a badly knotted dog leash without once making it feel like a big deal. We got engaged 18 months ago, on a quiet Tuesday evening, rather than some elaborate public proposal, exactly the way I'd told him I preferred. And I opened a dedicated wedding savings account that same month, depositing a portion of every paycheck, tax refund, and birthday gift into it with the kind of discipline that came naturally after years of stretching every dollar in nursing school. I added Brooke to that account 2 years earlier, actually, before the engagement even happened, back during a stretch when Denise had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, and I'd wanted someone in the family to have emergency access to funds if anything happened to me while I traveled for a conference. Brooke seemed touched by the gesture at the time, telling me it meant a lot that I trusted her, and for a while, that gesture genuinely felt like it might be the beginning of something better between us. Over the following 2 years, I watched Brooke's life change in ways that, looking back, I should have questioned more closely. She leased a BMW she'd previously told me she couldn't afford on her marketing coordinator salary, a car that showed up in her driveway one weekend with barely any explanation beyond. I finally treated myself. She took 2 vacations with her boyfriend, Chase, posting photos from Cancun, and later from a ski trip in Colorado. Captions full of champagne glasses and mountain views that never once mentioned where the money for any of it was actually coming from. She showed up to family dinners with new designer handbags every few months, each one casually mentioned as a gift from Chase or an early birthday present to myself. I noticed all of it, and I asked her about it once, casually at a coffee shop near her apartment, and she waved it off, saying Chase's family had money and he liked treating her, an explanation I accepted at the time, because questioning it further felt, somehow, like reverting back to the old sibling comparisons I'd spent years trying to move past. If any part of this is landing close to home for you, go ahead and drop a comment. I read every single one. I didn't check that joint account regularly. I want to be honest about that because so many people ask why I didn't catch it sooner. And the truth is simple. I trusted my stepsister. The same way you trust anyone you've shared a childhood bedroom hallway with for over a decade, however imperfect that childhood was. I checked my main checking account weekly for bills, cross-referencing every automatic payment against my budget spreadsheet, the way I'd done since college, but the wedding fund sat quietly in the background, growing, I assumed, exactly as it should have been, untouched and accumulating the way I'd carefully planned it to. The night my card declined, standing in that hallway at Ashford Manor with the coordinator's apologetic face in front of me, I felt something go cold and clear inside my chest, the particular clarity that comes right before you understand something you've been avoiding for a long time. I told the coordinator I'd resolve it within the hour, excused myself from the rehearsal dinner entirely, walked out to my car, and pulled up the account on my phone with hands that weren't quite steady, the ambient music and laughter from the dinner still faintly audible through the venue's tall windows behind me. The transaction history told the entire story in less than 2 minutes of scrolling, though it felt like an hour, each line item landing like a small, separate blow. $31,240 withdrawn across 18 months, in amounts small enough that I'd never noticed any single withdrawal as alarming against my own regular deposits, but large enough, cumulatively, to empty an account I genuinely believed was untouched. A $4,800 down payment to a BMW dealership, dated almost exactly to the week Brooke had first shown up in that car. A $2,100 charge to a Cancun resort, matching perfectly with the photos I remembered scrolling past on my phone months earlier without a second thought. 3 separate charges, totaling $6,300 to designer boutiques in Columbus, each one corresponding suspiciously well with handbags I'd complimented at family dinners without ever asking where the money had come from. The rest, spread across smaller withdrawals I could only assume covered Chase's rent, gifts, and whatever else Brooke had decided my wedding savings were actually meant for, in amounts of $200 and $400 and $650, scattered across 18 months like a slow, deliberate bleed rather than one obvious theft I might have caught in time. I sat in that car for almost 20 minutes, engine off, my rehearsal dinner still going on 20 yards away, doing the math over and over as though a different total might eventually emerge if I recalculated enough times. It never did. Every version of the arithmetic landed at the same place. My wedding fund, 4 years in the making, was functionally gone, replaced instead by a leased sedan and a handful of vacation photos I genuinely once thought were sweet. I didn't confront her that night. I want to be very clear about that, because so many people expect an explosive, immediate scene, and I simply didn't have it in me at my own rehearsal dinner, 3 days before marrying the person I loved. I walked back inside, smiled through the toasts, laughed at my father-in-law's rehearsed joke about groomsmen duties, and told Daniel only that there had been a small banking issue I'd handle in the morning, a lie of omission that felt necessary in the moment, if not entirely comfortable. I paid the venue balance myself from my personal checking account that night, standing in the parking lot on the phone with the coordinator, wiping out nearly all of my remaining individual savings to cover it before the deadline passed. The next morning, I called my father first, calmly laying out exactly what the transaction history showed, reading him the withdrawal dates and amounts one by one over the phone while he stayed mostly silent on the other end. He was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then he said, "Amelia, are you sure you're reading that right?" That response told me almost everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go within the family. A familiar reflex of doubt aimed at me rather than at the person who'd actually taken the money. I called a fraud specialist at my bank next. A woman named Patricia, who confirmed that because Brooke had been a legal co-owner on the account. This fell into a gray area that wouldn't qualify as straightforward theft under most bank fraud protections, though I could still pursue civil action if I chose to. And she walked me through printing out a full, notarized transaction record, just in case. I confronted Brooke 2 days later, the day before my wedding, at my father's house, in front of both my father and Denise, sitting around the same kitchen table where I used to do homework alone, most evenings, while Brooke got chauffeured to whatever social event was happening that week. I laid the transaction printout on the table between us and asked her, plainly, to explain the $31,240 that had disappeared from an account meant to fund my wedding. Brooke didn't deny it. Not really, though she also didn't seem particularly ashamed either. She said, instead, "I was going to pay it back before the wedding. I just didn't realize how fast it added up." delivered with the casual tone of someone explaining a minor scheduling conflict rather than the systematic draining of her stepsister's savings. When I asked her directly how exactly she planned to pay back over $31,000 on a marketing coordinator's salary within 3 days, she had no answer at all, just looked down at her hands, the way she used to when a teacher caught her not doing an assigned reading. Denise immediately jumped in, saying, "Amelia, please, don't do this the day before your wedding. Think about the timing," as though the timing was somehow my fault, rather than Brooke's for spending 3 years of my careful savings on a leased car and vacation photos posted for anyone to see. I asked Denise plainly whether she'd known, and she insisted she hadn't, though something in the speed and defensiveness of her denial made me doubt it. A doubt I've never fully been able to resolve one way or the other. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something, anything, in my defense. The way I'd waited my whole childhood for him to notice the quiet imbalance in how his 2 daughters were treated under the same roof. He said only, "Let's all just get through the wedding and we'll sort this out after," his eyes not quite meeting mine as he said it. I understood in that exact moment, standing in the kitchen where I'd done homework as a teenager while Brooke got driven to parties in a car I'd never had, that I was going to be the one absorbing the cost of everyone else's comfort, the way I always had been in that house, and that nothing about this particular crisis was going to change the fundamental pattern I'd lived inside for 18 years. I got married the next day anyway, because Daniel deserved his wedding day regardless of what my family had done, and because I refused to let Brooke take one more thing from me, including the day itself. It was smaller than I'd planned, paid for partly by a small personal loan I took out that week and partly by generous last-minute contributions from Daniel's parents, who were horrified when they learned the full story 2 days before the ceremony and quietly wired me $8,000 without being asked, simply saying, "We're not letting that woman ruin this for you." Daniel's mother, Linda, personally rearranged the seating chart that same evening to move Brooke to a table near the back, close to an exit, a small act of protection I hadn't asked for but appreciated more than I could say at the time. I smiled through every photo. I danced with my father, who never once brought up the money that night, as though silence might make the entire situation simply disappear if nobody acknowledged it out loud. Daniel and I took a short honeymoon to Vermont a week later, a modest cabin trip rather than the tropical getaway we'd originally planned, since a meaningful chunk of our remaining savings had gone toward covering the venue balance. Strangely, that scaled-down honeymoon became one of the more genuinely peaceful weeks of my adult life. Away from phone calls asking me to let this go. Away from the particular exhaustion of managing everyone else's discomfort with my own reality. Daniel, for his part, never once made me feel like the wedding had been diminished by what happened, telling me repeatedly throughout that week that he'd married me, not a particular venue or guest list, and that the actual vows we'd exchanged mattered infinitely more than anything Brooke had managed to take from us financially. 2 weeks after the wedding, once the immediate exhaustion of the ceremony and a short honeymoon in Vermont had passed, I retained an attorney, a woman named Carla Nguyen who specializes in family financial disputes, and filed a civil claim against Brooke for the withdrawn funds, supported by the full transaction history and the joint account paperwork showing my original deposits versus hers, which were, notably, exactly $0 across the entire 2 years the account existed. Carla told me the paperwork was about as clean a case as she'd seen in years, given how thoroughly Brooke had documented her own spending through receipts, social media posts, and even, absurdly, a thank you comment on Chase's Instagram post about the leased BMW. I also removed Brooke from every remaining shared account and updated my will, which had briefly listed her as a contingent beneficiary years earlier, during a moment of misplaced family optimism I now recognized as naive. Brooke has not spoken to me since the lawsuit was filed. My father calls occasionally, mostly asking when I'll let this go, a request I've stopped entertaining entirely, having realized that letting go, in this family, has always meant absorbing loss quietly, so nobody else has to feel uncomfortable. Denise has not called at all, which honestly feels like the most honest response out of everyone. Daniel's family, meanwhile, has folded me into their own gatherings with a warmth I hadn't experienced from blood relatives in over a decade, and his mother, in particular, has become something close to the maternal presence I never quite had growing up in that blended household, calling just to check in on my week, the way I'd always imagined a mother might, without an agenda attached. I ran into Chase, of all people, at a grocery store about a month after the wedding, and he had the audacity to ask, awkwardly, whether things had cooled down between me and Brooke, as though this were a minor sibling squabble over borrowed clothes rather than the systematic emptying of my wedding savings. I told him, plainly, that things hadn't cooled down and weren't likely to anytime soon, and he left the conversation looking considerably more uncomfortable than he'd arrived. I noticed, walking away, that he was wearing a new watch I didn't recognize, and I decided, for my own peace of mind, not to ask where it had come from. It occurred to me later, driving home, that Chase had likely benefited nearly as much from my wedding savings as Brooke had, and that the entire relationship between them may have been quietly subsidized, at least in part, by money that was supposed to pay for my flowers and my dress. My younger cousin Jenna, who'd always been closer to Brooke growing up, reached out to me a few weeks after the story became known throughout the extended family, telling me she'd suspected for over a year that something wasn't adding up about Brooke's sudden lifestyle upgrade, but hadn't wanted to say anything without proof. I appreciated the honesty, even delayed as it was, and it gave me a strange kind of comfort to know that at least one person in that extended family circle had noticed the same warning signs I'd chosen to overlook. The civil case is still moving through the courts, slower than I'd like, but Carla assures me the transaction paperwork is about as clean a case as she's seen in years, given how thoroughly Brooke documented her own spending through receipts and social media posts. Whatever the court eventually decides, I've already gotten the thing I actually needed most out of this entire ordeal: clarity, finally, about exactly where I stand in that family, and permission, finally, to stop hoping for a version of fairness that apparently was never going to arrive on its own. Here's what I want you to take away from tonight. In my own words, because I earned the right to say this plainly after watching a decade of favoritism finally reveal its true cost. Trust extended to family isn't obligation, and being taken advantage of by someone who shares your last name doesn't make the theft any less real. You are allowed to pursue what's actually owed to you, even when everyone around you asks you to prioritize their comfort over your own justice. You are allowed to build a new family by choice, out of the people who actually show up, regardless of what any birth certificate or marriage license says about who's supposed to matter most. I think sometimes about that parking lot at Ashford Manor, scrolling through 18 months of quiet betrayal in the dark while my rehearsal dinner continued without me 20 yards away. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives in moments like that, unwanted but ultimately necessary. The kind that finally lets you stop excusing a pattern you'd spent years half noticing and fully ignoring. I don't know how the civil case will ultimately resolve, and at this point, I've made a kind of peace with not needing to know exactly when or how. What I do know is that I walked into my own wedding the next day with my head held high, surrounded by people who'd actually shown up for me, and that in itself already felt like the truest form of justice available to me at the time. My practice has grown even further this past year, oddly enough, as though the whole ordeal freed up some part of me that had been quietly bracing for family disappointment for most of my adult life. I hired a fourth therapist in the spring, a warm, capable young woman named Priya, who reminds me a little of who I was at her age, expanded into a slightly larger office space 2 doors down from the original clinic, and started, for the first time, keeping a separate emergency fund that no one else's name is attached to, held quietly in an account only Daniel and I know the details of, with a second, backup account at an entirely different bank that no family member has ever heard mentioned. Some lessons I've learned only really stick once you've paid for them the hard way, and I've paid for this one thoroughly enough that I don't intend to repeat it. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.